you, Dr. Devapriya Sannal, for a very generous introduction. Thank you, Dr. Rathindranath Bosu, for inaugurating the seminar, the webinar rather. Dr. Roy, my fellow speaker, Dr. Aparna Bandyopadhyay. I'm particularly grateful to Srimati Manjari Chakraborty, head of the Department of History, Surendranath Evening College, who contacted me and continuously stayed in touch with me so that a theme like this could gradually evolve. It's a very significant topic, as Dr. Sannal has already pointed out. I'm grateful to the college. I'm grateful to the principal madam for giving me this opportunity to share my views. Now, my job is a little bit challenging because you can see that my journey is a long journey from the medieval period to the colonial period. Now, it is very significant that when the Quran, Holy Quran discusses Joseph, there's an indication, there's a focus on the power, on the potential power of enrapturing love, focus on love. I'm saying this because we shall be dealing with mysticism as well, as indicated by Dr. Sannal, that the mystics often try to legitimize their position regarding women's issues by citing the Quran, by citing the Hadith, that is the sayings and deeds of the Prophet, by citing the Sirat, that is the biography of the Prophet, and so on. So the starting point, entry point is Quran. We shall see how Quranic instructions could be interpreted by Indian mystics, Indian saints, Indian theologians when they entered into discourse involving women. That is very crucial. That's why I started with the Holy Quran. That in the Holy Quran there is scope to discuss this issue regarding women within Islamic societies all over the world. Now, it can even be said that Sufism was more favorable to the development of feminine activities than were any branches of Islam, because we have seen wherever Sufism became popular, women came to enjoy a greater amount of freedom. The sympathy of the Prophet for women and his 4 daughters is well known. The veneration of Fatima, that is the beloved, one of the beloved daughters of the Prophet, Fatima. Fatima is very significant. We shall have occasions to discuss Fatima. Fatima is the symbol of mystical knowledge. Now, there are different layers of knowledge. When we shall discuss this gender issue, this women's issue, you have to keep it in the back of your mind that knowledge is not homogeneous. There are different layers of knowledge. And Fatima, the beloved daughter of the Prophet and the wife of Ali, you know the film song, Qawwali song, Damaddam Mast Kalandar, Ali the Paira number, that Ali is the husband of Fatima. And Fatima is venerated very much in the Shia world, in Iran, and also parts of Iraq where you have significant Shia population. So, if you discuss the feminine elements within Islam, you have to remember such things, such symbols within Quran, such Quranic surahs, and also such family members of the Prophet who are venerated within the Muslim communities and Muslim societies all over the world. But we shall be focusing our discussion in South Asia for the time constraint that has been inflicted on us for due reason. Now, the Quran speaks repeatedly of the Al-Muslimin wa Al-Muslimat. You know, Quran is written in Arabic. Al-Muslimin wa Al-Muslimat wa Al-Mu'minin wa Al-Mu'minat. For Muslim men and women and for believing men and women. So the appeal of Quran is very, very inclusive. There's an appeal to both men and women. So this is very significant. So when we have to select an entry point, so far as discussion and discourse on women is concerned, Quran can be the starting point. And Quran has been interpreted, Quran has been cited by the mystics as well as the theologians and also the scholars when they discussed the position of women within Islam, both in medieval and South and as colonial context. That is very much important. So I started with the Quran. So the very fact that the first true saint of Islam was a woman. The first true saint of Islam was a woman. The first person apart from the Prophet Muhammad who embraced Islam is a woman. Bibi Khadija, the wife of the Prophet, was the first person within Islam apart from the Prophet Muhammad who embraced Islam. This is a very significant information. So women are very much respected and venerated within Islamic understanding. That you have to remember. And the great lover was Rabia Basri. She was from Basra. That's why Basri, Rabia Basri. If you follow Muslim names, sometimes place names are attached with the main name, the first name. So Rabia Basri. Rabia, she was from Basra. She flourished in the 8th century. The women played a leading role in the theological world, in the spiritual world, quite early in the history of Islam. That is our entry point. That is very important. Now, Rabia is so popular within Muslim societies all over the world that if you notice any pious woman within the Muslim societies, she is compared with Rabia, and often she is just projected as the second Rabia. This is true also in case of South Asia, that is India. Now, before Sufism arose, women were recognized as saints, such as Amina. You know that Nazrul song. Tora dekhe ja Amina Mayer Kole. So Amina is the mother of the Prophet. So this is very significant. Amina, the mother of the Prophet, is venerated by Muslims. And Fatima is the beloved daughter, which I have already shared with you, who enjoy veneration of all Muslims because of their relationship to the Prophet. So it is not surprising that when Sheikh Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlavi, a contemporary of Jahangir, he was a great scholar Sufi, Alim Sufi. Alim, that is, he had scriptural knowledge. He was a Maulavi. At the same time, he was a Sufi. So Alim Sufi, not Sufi Alim. This term is used. So he was both an Alim as well as a Sufi. He was a great scholar who wrote in Persian, New Arabic, and other languages. He flourished during the time of Jahangir. Now, this is very significant. I draw your attention to this very important fact that Sheikh Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlavi, carefully follow the name. Sheikh means leader. Sheikh can be a Sufi. Sheikh can be a scholar. Sheikh Abdul Haq, his actual name is Abdul Haq. Muhaddis is not his name. Muhaddis is his title. Since he was learned in Hadith, that's why he is Muhaddis. Aisha was a female. She was learned in Hadith, Muhaddisa. So feminine term is Muhaddisa and masculine term is Muhaddis. So Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlavi, and he flourished in Delhi. That's why Dehlavi. So if you have to follow the names of Muslim scholars, you have to follow very carefully. You have to follow the entire name so that you can locate that particular scholar or saint in the particular milieu, socio-cultural milieu. So Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlavi, otherwise you can see that he was a scripturalist. He was well versed in scriptures. He was well versed in hadith. But I draw your attention to this fact that in spite of his apparent conservative identity, he devoted an entire chapter in his very famous work, Akbarul Akhyar, to women. An entire chapter in the book was devoted to women. I draw your attention to this fact. In the Persian language, he wrote this book. So this is a very significant information for us. Now, you can juxtapose the scholars Sufi of the medieval period with the scholars of today. And sometimes, I leave it to you, but if you compare, sometimes you may find, I think, that medieval scholars, the medieval predecessors, they were more liberal, even when they are projected as relatively conservative personalities. This is significant. Now, it's a debate going on. I will have to cut the story short because of the time constraint. This is called by German scholars as alternative modernity. That modernity is not the monopoly of the West. A form of modernity was also generated in the Oriental world because of the activities of the mystic scholars or scholar mystics. This is very much important. There is one example. He was so modern, so inclusive that he devoted an entire chapter on female Sufis, on women. very important. Without this chapter, we could not have written. I have written a chapter on female Sufis. I could not have written the chapter on female Sufis without this Persian book on that at least devoted one chapter, entire chapter on women saints. This is very significant. Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, the 13th century, who died in the early 14th century, 13th century famous Chishti saint of South Asia. There was a majlis, and in the majlis, his followers asked him, what should be the position of women in society? Now look, carefully follow the response of Nizamuddin Aulia, one of the most illustrious Chishti saints of South Asia, entire South Asia. Sher az besha biru aed kase purshid ki ashe norast ya mada. I'm translating from Persian. When a lioness emerges from the forest, no one raises any question about her sex, because the primary concern of the human being at that moment is his personal safety and security. So he will be fleeing for life. You will be running for life when you see a lioness emerging from the forest. You will not ask, you will not carry out a research to see whether that is a male or a female. Very significant. The Sufis had a sense of humor. So Sufis were very, in a very allegorical manner, they used to instruct their followers. So this was the response of Nizamuddin Aulia when he was asked this question, what should be the position of women in society? He implied that women are as powerful as lioness. You have watched Animal Planet. The lioness is the principal predator, not the lion. Lion's presence in the lion family is rather parasitical. So lioness is the principal predator. So in other words, he implied, rather in an allegorical fashion, why I can keep you pondering, I can keep you just thinking on this issue, why he is using such allegories to respond to such a crucial, pertinent question. And that a woman can be compared with a lioness, implied that a woman can possess spiritual qualities, and under such circumstances, she can be elevated in the spiritual hierarchy just like a male, her male counterpart. So this was the position, egalitarian position, just reflected by Nizamuddin Aulia in that majlis. Very important. It would be relevant to study the role of the mothers. Very important. Mothers in the biographies of the Sufis. Biographies of the Sufis are known as Tazkira. Tazkira is very important. You know, biography of the Bhakti saints is very important. So I see this issue in this way, that the mothers of many Bhakti saints are venerated within India. So the Sufis created a literature, parallel literature, where the mothers of Sufi saints were also venerated in that sort of biographies, Tazkira, as I've already mentioned. So mothers of saints are very much venerated within the Indian tradition, as is resonated in the pages of Tazkira or the biographies of the Sufis. First religious instruction which the Sufis received, almost inevitably they received it from their mothers. That's why the Prophet even said that the paradise lies at the feet of the mothers. The paradise lies at the feet of the mothers. Very important. So earlier I have referred I have cited the Quran. Now I am citing the Hadith. That is, paradise lies at the feet of the mothers, uttered by the Prophet Muhammad himself. Sayings and deeds of the Prophet is Hadith. So the Sufis played a significant role. This is often not acknowledged. Played a significant role in popularizing the Quran and Hadith in Indian society. They popularized the Hadith. They made the Hadith relevant to the common people, intelligible to the common people, relevant to the Indian circumstances. So the Prophet venerated his mother in one way or other. That is manifested in the Hadith that I have shared with you. Now, whether it will be Baba Farid Ganji Shakkar of Punjab. Baba Farid Ganji Shakkar is the master or murshid of Nizamuddin Aulia. I've mentioned Nizamuddin Aulia. He also venerated his mother. There is no doubt that many elderly women within the Sufi families contributed to the spiritual formation of some of the greatest Sufis of South Asia, greatest Sufi saints of South Asia. So women had been venerated as mothers of prominent Sufi saints in South Asian history and culture. This is one important observation. I will demonstrate from one Sufi text available in the Persian language. I have translated it. On one occasion, there was a drought, that is Imsak-e Bara. There was a drought in Delhi. Everybody began to pray for rain. Bara means rain. And the sheikh, one particular Sufi sheikh or saint, was requested to do likewise, because the people believed that if the Sufi joined in that prayer, there will be rain, there will be good harvest following that rainfall, adequate rainfall. The sheikh then took a thread from a garment worn by his mother. He held it in his hand and began to pray. I'm just quoting, "O God, the chastity of my mother is well known. She had never unveiled her face before the strangers, and I am praying on behalf of this pious lady. Please send rain for us. As Sheikh in Haraf Guftan, as Khuda Bara Ferestadan." That is the Persian thing. After hearing the Sheikh's appeal, God sent rain for them. So this is the supernatural power of a Sufi mother that is being shared, that is being popularized in the biographies, in the Tazkira. So this supernatural power was attaching this supernatural power with the motherhood of a Sufi saint. You are actually legitimizing the image of a Sufi mother within the Indian subcontinent. And this had similarity with the ways the Bhakti saints popularized their mothers in the Bhakti biographies, in the Bhakti texts. This is very significant. Now, you may ask me this question, that these are Persian texts, whether the Sufis try to reach out to the masses in the vernacular language, because the vernacular language will be intelligible to the masses, common people will not follow Persian. So what is the mechanism followed by the Sufis to reach out to the masses, to engage with the masses in a more creative manner? So this is very interesting. I will just share with you certain types of Sufi literature, mainly composed in the vernacular language, maybe Dakhni Urdu in the Deccan, maybe Bengali in Bengal, maybe Sindhi in Sindh, maybe Punjabi in Punjab, maybe Urdu in northern India. Charkha Nama. Charkha, you know, Charkha was very popular to Gandhi. Gandhi popularized Charkha. I'm not going into that. In the interactive session, I will be delighted to respond some queries involving Gandhi with Sufism. Charkha was popularized by Gandhi, but Charkha Nama from time immemorial was popular in India. Now the Sufis utilized this popularity of Charkha and composed songs in the vernacular languages, as I've mentioned already. And these sort of songs are known as Charkha Nama. That is, the women folk, when they used the Charkha, they used to sing the song to generate a sort of a physical energy. That is very much important. Charkha Nama, they were popularly known as Charkha Nama. For example, the central point of the Charkha, wheel of the Charkha, looks like Mim. Mim for Muhammad. Mim is the Arabic letter. And the handle of the Charkha, if seen from 90-degree angle, looks like the letter Alif, Alif for Allah. So when you are operating the Charkha like this, the women folk will be chanting Allah Muhammad, Allah Muhammad. This is singable. This is singable. So in this way, Sufis try to reach out to the women folk, even in the countryside, through this sort of Charkha Namas being composed by the very very creative, imaginaire Sufi saints in South Asia. And there had been Chakki Nama also. Chakki, or the metallic rod, is often used to grind food grains. And this Chakki, when looked from 90-degree angle, looks like Alif, Alif for Allah. The Chakki Nama, while grinding food grains, songs were sung by the female folk in the countryside. So in this way, the Sufis were, in a very creative manner, imaginative manner, were engaging with the women folk in the countryside. Women were not peripheral within Sufism. They entered the mainstream of Sufi spiritual practices in this way. Lori Nama, that is the lullabies. When you are sending your child to sleep, when they are asleep, you are singing these sort of songs to facilitate this drowsiness of the child. Lori Nama. These are important songs, mainly sung by ladies. So this is the feminine aspect of the folk songs composed by the Sufi saints. And also Suhagan Nama, that is the wedding songs. They mainly are sung in female voices. So these are the feminine dimensions utilized and also incorporated within Sufi experiences of life. That is very much crucial. I am sharing that with you. Nizamuddin Auliya had deep respect for his mother. He used to say, Walida Mara Bakhuda Tala Asnai Buj. My mother was the way towards the kingdom of God. Very important. Now, Nizamuddin Aulia came from Central Asia, from Balkh to Badayun. He first came to Badayun. His father died early. He came with his mother when he was a child. Bibi Zulekha was his mother. I draw your attention to this fact. This mother played a very prominent role in the selection of teachers, appropriate teachers for the training of his son. So look at the executive power of the mother. The mother is translating into practice the desire to train his son by selecting able teachers for his son. So this is the dominant position of women in some of the Turkish tribes. He was a Turk I have mentioned. So Bibi Zulekha is coming to India, to Badayun from Balkh. And after coming to India, Bibi Zulekha found that Sultana Razia was ruling India, was ruling from Delhi. This is a significant information for us. Sultana Razia is also a Turk. And I have mentioned that some of the Turkish tribes were matriarchal families. They had matriarchal understanding of life. So this is very much important. So we have discussed that this favorable disposition of the Sufis towards the women folk, this can be linked not only to Sufi theology, not only to Quran, not only to Tazkira, not only to Chisti Sufi practice, but also to this sort of matriarchal habits of some of the Turkish tribes in Central Asia. So they carried forward some of the matriarchal habits when they migrated to India. This is very much significant. So this explains why some of the Sufis were favorably disposed towards the women folk in India. The devotees of Raushan Bibi, I am now coming to Bengal, medieval Bengal. Devotees of Raushan Bibi have built a beautiful Dargah. He's a 13th century female Sufi of Bengal in the Bosirhat subdivision in the Taragunia village near the banks of Ichamuti river. So Bibi's followers, I mean Raushan Bibi's followers have built a beautiful Dargah. As a mark of their devotion, the Zimmadars, that is the Sebayet, the trustees of the Dargah, have kept the place very neat and clean. Incense is also burnt regularly at the Dargah. Devotees offer flowers, fruits, and sweets at the Dargah as minnat. Actually, we use the term manot. Manot is not a Bengali word. It is derived from the Arabic term minnat. This is interesting. Minnat. Every year in the Bengali month of Chaitra, Urs, that is the death anniversary of a Sufi saint, is celebrated here with much enthusiasm. So death is very significant within Sufism, within Islam. And this understanding of death has a gender dimension. I may not delve deep into all aspects today because of the time constraint, but we shall elaborate later on if you interact with me over the emails. On this occasion of Urs, a fair is also held here which lasts for nearly 10 days. More than 1 lakh people visit this fair and they are entertained by the bandsmen, Kawal singers. You know, Kawali, I have mentioned Kawali a while ago. This music is very important. This music is associated with the female presence within the Sufi festivals. And also, music poses a serious challenge to hegemonic orthodoxy. That's why Rabindranath Tagore and Gandhi, they were in favor of music and dance, because music and dance pose a challenge to hegemonic orthodoxy. And Sufism also represents heterodoxy, and sometimes they represent a challenge to hegemonic orthodoxy. So this interconnectedness is very important. And the night sky is beautifully decorated with fireworks. And it is said that Raja Krishna Chandra Roy donated land for the erection of the Dargah a long time ago, because Krishna Chandra also was keen to enhance his popularity among the masses, because he knew both the Hindus and Muslims used to visit the Dargah. So an interfaith dialogue is sustained by such Sufi festivities. This is important. I draw your attention to this fact. So while I am discussing this gender discourse was entangled with this interfaith dialogue in the subcontinent, entangled with composite culture in the Indian subcontinent. That is also a crucial aspect to remember. It is a well-known fact that Mian Mir was the first mystical guide of the Mughal prince, an ill-fated Mughal prince, Dara Shikoh. Dara Shikoh, you know, Shah Jahan's eldest son, who was supposed to be the monarch, but could not become the monarch at all. He was executed by his younger brother Aurangzeb. So Myanmar's name is very significant. Mir was destined to be the murshid or guide of Dara Shikoh. So you have to understand that in the European Renaissance, there was a collaboration linkage between court Renaissance and popular Renaissance. So in India, if you have to understand the gender discourse, if you have to understand the contribution of mysticisms towards the efflorescence of Indian composite culture, you have to understand the linkages between court culture and popular culture. So far, we have cited some aspects of popular culture through Chakki Nama, to Charkha Nama, to Lori Nama and Suhagan Nama. Now let us once again come back to the court culture, the elite culture, the Ashraf culture represented by the Mughals, represented by Jahanara, represented by Dara Shikoh and others. This Myanmar was venerated by Dara Shikoh, and Myanmar's name is important. I was speaking about composite culture. Myanmar was supposed to be the guru of Dara Shikoh and Jahanara, but he died early. That's why his disciple Mullah Shah actually became the guru of Dara Shikoh. So Myanmar was asked to lay the foundation stone of the Gurdwara, main Gurdwara of the Sikhs. So this is very important. The Sikhs used to venerate Myanmar. This is an example of composite culture, that the Sikhs had to become belligerent towards the Mughals for various other reasons. Otherwise, spiritually speaking, culturally speaking, they shared the cosmopolitan culture unleashed by the Mughals. Otherwise, they would not have invited the mystic saint, Sufi saint, Myanmar to lay the foundation stone of Harmandir Sahib. The original Gurdwara of the Sikhs, Harmandir Sahib. That is very important that you have to understand. Venerated by the Sikhs, Harmandir Sahib Gurdwara. Myanmar's daughter was also had also mystical knowledge. Was Bibi Jamal Khatun, was very popular. Was an outstanding Qadriya Sufi saint. So the Chistis and the Qadris played a prominent role so far as this gender discourse is concerned. So far as sustaining this gender discourse in Indian mysticism is concerned, the Chistis and Qadriyas played a prominent role. And this linkage with the Sikhs, which I have already mentioned, is very significant. The Sikhs shared something in common with the Sufis. Say the langar. Even today, you will notice the langar is mainly managed by females, by women. So langar was a practice followed by the Sufis as well, the free kitchen. So through langar, the Sufis and the Sikhs tried to translate into practice their egalitarian principles. So I'm not delving deep into that, but these are important aspects. Their inclusivity is resonated in the act of langar when women were playing a major role in conducting the langar, both in Sikhism and in Sufism. That is very important that you have to understand. And a message of humanity is spread through that. I cannot delve deep into all aspects. So Jahanara was very learned in mystical knowledge, and her it's not accidental. Her informal name is Fatima. Fatima is the beloved daughter of the Prophet. Fatima is known for mystical knowledge. Jahanara is also known for mystical knowledge. So Jahanara actually was so learned that in the Persian language, she composed the biography of Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, the doyen of the Chishti saints in South Asia. And that text in the Persian language composed by Jahanara is known as Munis ul Arwa. So look at the learning process of women, elite women, and that was sustained by Sufi activities. Sufis played a major role so far as the sustenance of gender dimension in South Asian history and culture is concerned. Now, this Munis ul Arwa, that is dedicated to Moinuddin Chishti of Ajmer, is actually means the comforter of souls. That is, she projected Moinuddin Chishti of Ajmer as the comforter of human souls. Very important. But the magnetic personality and piety of Myanmar and the reputation of Mullah Shah drew Dara Shikoh towards the Qadriya fraternity. So Mughals were gradually moving from Chishti order to the Qadriya order. Qadriyas are very significant. I may not have the time to delve deep into that because I'm discussing gender, not Sufism. But it is very interesting that how Qadris were interested in Vedas and Upanishads also. Not only interested in involving women in the spiritual activities, but were also interested in Vedas and Upanishads. And Tarashuko, another Kadriya Sufi, also just translated the Upanishad into Persian known as Sirri Akbar. So these entanglements are very important. Tarashuko Jahanara Chisti, Jahanara Kadri, this sort of connectivity is very important so far as sustenance of gender dimension in South Asia is concerned. Now, there is a time constraint. I will very quickly switch over to the colonial period, Muslim women in the context of the colonial period. And I think 1870s is a demarcating decade, is a defining decade in the history of gender discourse in South Asia, because in the 1870s, we noticed the emergence of educated Muslim middle class. In the 1870s, we noticed the optimum utilization of printing technology within the Bengali Muslim community. We find that the W. Hunter is changing his attitude towards the Indian Muslims in 1870s. His book, The Indian Musulmans, had been published in the 1870s. We have seen that the Wahhabi trials had been executed in the 1870s. We have seen that pan-Islamic ideas started to spread through this sort of texts from 1870s. These are very important. We see the emergence of first Bengali Muslim novelist in the form of Musharraf Hussain, also in the 1870s. These are important findings. And Musharraf Hussain not only wrote many novels, not only wrote another very important book. I draw your attention to the fact, Amar Jiboner Jiboni. Amar Jiboner Jiboni. It's an autobiographical work where he glorified his second wife, Bibi Kulsum. Now, Kulsum is one of the daughters of the Prophet, and Musharraf Hussein's wife, Mir Musharraf Hussain, was a novelist. His wife's name was also Bibi Kulsum. So, Musharraf Hussain tried to educate her wife, and her wife was educated. So, when you speak about women's education, you have to discuss this autobiographical work by Musharraf Hussain, Amar Jiboner Jiboni, very important. And you will find this gender discourse also in the novel by Gaur Kishore Ghosh, Prem Nahi, and also the novel Abdullah, very important. Now, in the 19th century, Keramot Ali Jaunpuri, who was an alim, a mullah, but he was not a Bengali-speaking alim. He mainly stayed in Bengal, but he was an ambulatory alim who came from Jaunpur. You can gather from his name. He could understand Bengali, but he was Urdu-speaking. So he noticed that due to the activities of the Bengali Hindu intelligentsia, mainly Brahmo intelligentsia, there was a very lively debate going on in Bengal about women. And he was one of the pioneers so far as writing a text in the Urdu language on women's education is concerned. This is very significant. As early as in 1827 and 28, he composed in Urdu Miftahul Jannat, and he was very much impressed by the discourse on women going on in Bengal, mainly that was being spearheaded by the Brahmo leaders. And he composed this book, Miftahul Jannat, where he expressed the view that women should be educated within Islam. That is very important. Now, I draw your attention to this fact that you have to, let us put it in an equation. Subtle tension was going on within the Bengal Muslim society from the late 19th century, as I have already indicated. M4, capital M4. Remember this. One M is for Maulavi. Maulavi is trying to exercise his power, exercise his control in the Muslim society, Bengali Muslim society. Middle class was emerging, as I have already indicated. Mir Musharraf Hussain was a middle class representative. Middle class was emerging. Another M. Image of the Prophet, image of Muhammad was becoming popular. Muhammad was being portrayed as the leader of the Muslim community in Bengal. So Muhammad's image is very important. You will find that in Gaur Kishore Ghosh's Prem Nahi, Shafiqul Islam, the main character, is venerating the Prophet, the Muhammad. So another aim is Muhammad. Another image is what should be the attitude towards Murshid, the Sufi Pir, another aim. So there was a subtle tension going on between these four aims. Who will be venerated, whose position will be what within Bengali Muslim society? Maulavi, middle class, Muhammad, and Murshid. Very important. If you discuss the gender, this gender dimension will remain incomplete if you fail to understand this equation between these four aims: Maulavi, middle class, Muhammad, and Murshid. Now, um, you have to understand that this was not an isolated development. In Aligarh also, biographies of the Prophet was being written. The biography of the Prophet was being written in Aligarh. So Aligarh movement was also trying to portray the image of the Prophet. But remember, this is the rational image of the Prophet. Rational image of the Prophet. I have spoken about the fact that knowledge is not monolithic. Knowledge is different. Knowledge has different layers. The wife of the Prophet represented scriptural knowledge. That's why Aisha is known as Muhaddisa. Aisha was popular in urban Bengal. Aisha was not that popular in rural Bengal. I may or may not have the time to elaborate on that later on. Fatima, the beloved daughter of the Prophet, was the representative of mystical knowledge I have already mentioned. Khadija, the first wife of the Prophet, represented commercial knowledge, represented household knowledge, home science, and also represented social knowledge. Very important. Khadija, commercial knowledge. Actually, the Prophet was employed by Khadija as a camel driver, Mir Karwa, caravan leader. Khadija was quite rich. Khadija was a widow, was married to the Prophet, was elder to the Prophet. So they were very happy. I will have occasions to come back to this conjugal relationship between the Prophet Muhammad and Khadija. What was its significance in Bengali Muslim society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? This is very crucial. One important debate is Porda. Porda means veil. Which sort of Porda should be followed? Now, most of the Muslim intelligentsia, like Amir Ali, like Rokeya Sakwat Hussain, they settle down on moderate Porda. That is, Porda should be observed, but a moderate form of Porda can be observed in Bengali Muslim society. So there was a debate that was going on, which sort of Porda should be followed, rigid Porda or modest Porda or moral Porda. So settlement was in favor of moral Porda. For modesty, some sort of Porda should be maintained, but that will be a moderate Porda, not very rigid Porda. Now, again, if we switch over to the countryside, you will find that often Muslim women not observing Porda, they are working in the field side by side with the male folk without observing the veil. There are different reasons, because if you observe the Porda in that context, that will be dangerous, because there are snakes and other things. You have to be very much aware in the field, in the rice field, to carry out your activities. There, in the evening, after a monotonous life, day life, hard life in the rice field, evening was meant for some sort of recreation. Jari songs and other forms of folk songs are sung, where women used to take part, but observing the veil. That is, women were asked to listen to the Jari songs from behind the bamboo curtain, bamboo curtain. So this Porda is different from urban Porda. You can understand. The women are not visible, so it is not necessary to observe the strict Porda. They can listen to the folk songs from beyond the fence, bamboo fence, bera. So I call it provincialization of Porda. Provincialization of Porda. Provincialization. There is always a tension going on between the universal symbols of Islam or religion and the provincial or local symbol of religion. So here I will say this bamboo. Bamboo is not available easily in the desert region. It is available in Bengal. It is available in Assam. So this sort of bamboo fence is actually a provincial version of the Porda, provincial version of the veil. That's why I call this sort of a ritual as the provincialization of Porda. This is integral to the identity formation of the common people in the countryside. That you have to understand very well. Now, another important debate that took place, that some people discussed, that when Aisha led the battle of the camel, led in the battle of the camel, some people said that those who were anti-Porda, they said Aisha was not probably using the Porda, strict Porda, when she was leading the battle, in the battle of leading the battalion in the battle of the camel, famous battle of the camel. But some others said, no, look, Aisha was maintaining the veil and was leading the battalion in the Battle of the Camel. So these sort of debates are there. I am not delving deep into the literature that is available before us because of the time constraint. Another important dimension that featured in this gender discourse is healthcare and hygiene aspect. Healthcare and hygiene aspect. Now remember, these are very much entangled with contemporary developments. You might remember that there was a Balkan war going on. Turkey was in danger because of some Balkan countries which attacked Turkey. So Turkey was at war with many Balkan countries in 1912. That is before on the eve of the First World War. That is very much important. And there was a Red Crescent medical mission from India to Turkey. Red Crescent medical mission from India to Turkey. And when there was one from Siraji, Ismail Hussain Siraji went from Bengal in that medical mission, came back to Bengal and said that women came to enjoy greater freedom in Turkey in the Balkan wars as non-combatants. So these are important, and these women are very conscious about health and hygiene. This is very much important that you have to understand. And there was another project against the this sort of medical consciousness, hygiene consciousness. Akram Khan was editing a newspaper, editing a journal, Mashik Mohammadi. There he discussed elaborately on this sort of consciousness regarding health and hygiene relating to women. So this is very much important that you have to understand. And Akram Khan also pointed out that women were allowed to even challenge the Khulafa Rashidin, and the women were allowed to debate with the Khulafa Rashidin. And he cited from one Sahih hadith, that is authentic hadith, that women came to enjoy great power in the prophetic era, in the classical era of Islam, and they were even allowed to debate with Hazrat Umar regarding certain feminine issues. I am not going into that. Abul Kalam Azad's pan-Islam is another aspect that I am not going to discuss here because there is a time constraint. I just try to mention that there were even non-Muslim authors who were writing the biographies of the Prophet in the late 19th and early 20th century, and they also, in these biographies of the Prophet, the family members of the Prophet had been used as role models by the biographers, and some of the biographers are non-Muslims. They were Brahmos and Hindus who composed these biographies of the Prophet to promote a better understanding between different communities, to promote comparative theological studies in Bengal. So they were carrying out this work, and they mentioned the role of women in Muslim society, and they hailed the step taken by the Prophet and his family members so far as women, a redefinition of women's role in society is concerned. That is very much crucial. Now, you know that there was an All India Muslim Ladies Conference, popularly known as Anjuman, All India Muslim Ladies Conference, or popularly known as Anjuman, where the Begum of Bhopal patronized the publication of books on child rearing, on healthcare, and so on. So Begum of Bhopal, it's not only a Bengali phenomena. This was happening in Upper India, this was happening in MP and other places as well. It is portrayed in many, in the Deobandi circles and also in the Sirat literature. Sirat means biography of the Prophet. That Prophet was very neat and clean. So there was an emphasis on cleanliness by citing the example of the Prophet, and women were asked to use the Prophet as a role model when it comes to the question of health and hygiene in society. Not only Bengali Muslim society, but in Urdu-speaking society, Sindhi society, Punjabi society as well. The Prophet took great care to clean his teeth, miswak, great care to clean his teeth. So this health consciousness was popularized by citing the example of the Prophet among the women population. And Fadlul Karim is writing a book in Bengali, Bibi Khadija. Bibi Khadija is a biographical work on Bibi Khadija, the first wife of the Prophet, who is projected as a role model here in this Bengali biography of Khadija. And Khadija is projected as Tahira. Tahira is someone who is very clean. So cleanliness is very important. Now the British were putting emphasis on cleanliness. You know, there had been many epidemics in the late 19th century, cholera and other things, other sorts of epidemics. There was the tap water which was introduced in late 19th century. So these were also reflected in the biographical literature, in the gender discourses. So women, members of the Prophet's family, were projected as people who promoted and sustained cleanliness in society. This is very much important. Another very interesting, important example is there in this biography. Aisha's grandmother, that is, Aisha is the wife of the Prophet. Grandmother told her that early rising is good for the health, moderate meals is good for the health, regular meals should be taken at regular intervals. These are important dimensions. Now, in 1900, there was a famine, as you know, and the Hindu social workers required Florence Nightingale to inspire the Hindu women to carry forward relief activities during this famine. Florence Nightingale, you know who is Florence Nightingale, I need not elaborate. During the Balkan Wars, when Ismail Hossein Shirazi came back and started to write in the articles in the Bengali Muslim journals on his experience about the women playing the role of non-combatants in the battlefield in Turkey and in the Balkan region, there Aisha and Fatima had been projected as Florence Nightingales of Bengali Muslim society. This is very significant. So Prophet advised his followers to nurse the sick people. There had been very many prophetic wars, as you know. So Prophet asked followers to take care of the sick people who were wounded in the warfare, should be taken care of. And so women can play a role as non-combatants by taking care of these wounded soldiers. That is very crucial. And again, in the 20th century context, on the eve of First World War, women were playing this role of non-combatants and were emulating Florence Nightingales to extend their service to the wounded soldiers of their fighting community. This is very important. Another important discourse came to the fore was marriage. Marriage question was very issue in this gender aspect. Widow remarriage issue was very important. Child marriage issue was discussed. Polygamy was discussed. Talaq or divorce issue was discussed. These four major dimensions had been discussed in contemporary literature so far as discourse on women is concerned. Widow remarriage, child marriage, polygamy, and divorce. Now, there had been a lack of widow remarriage within Muslim society. So the social reformers argued that probably due to the influence, Hindu influence, there was a reluctance among the Muslims to marry a widow. So this is one aspect. So Vidyasagar, when he launched his widow remarriage campaign, as you know, he cited the example of Muslim communities and said that in Islamic scriptures, there is no injunction against widow remarriage, and rather widow remarriage is hailed in Islamic civilization. So Vidyasagar wanted to popularize his project of widow remarriage by citing the example of Islamic scriptures. This is very much important. And some of the Muslim reformers even went to the extent of saying that those who are discouraging widow remarriage, they are actually performing shirk and bidah, that is innovation and polytheism, that is un-Islamic. They are performing un-Islamic practices by discouraging widow remarriage. I am winding up. I know my time is ticking up. That is very much important. There was one very prominent social reformer in late 19th century Bengal, Munshi Muhammad Meherullah of Jasor. He wrote a book, Vidhova Ganjana o Bishad Bhandar. Vidhova Ganjana o Bishad Bhandar. I think he was influenced at some point of time by Altaf Hussain Hali of Aligarh, who wrote the biography of Syed Ahmed Khan in Urdu. Altaf Hussain Hali was a famous Urdu poet and wrote Munajat-i-Bewa, that is the prayer of a widow. And he was also famous for composing Musaddas-e-Hali, you know. So Hali was an influence, was an impact on the Bengali Muslim writers when the writers such as Munshi Meherullah composed Vidhova Ganjana or Bishad Bhandar, where he exposed the lamentation of the miserable widow in Bengali Muslim society and wanted to get rid of this constraint that was emulated from the Hindu society in the neighborhood. Zamiruddin, the disciple of Meherullah, said that Munshi Meherullah's book became very influential so far as emancipation of women is concerned in Bengal. That is very much important. So I draw your attention to this fact that Rokeya Sakhawat Hussain also said that the Prophet Muhammad used to console the widows, Yeah, Prophet Muhammad was a comforter of widows. That is, the Prophet Muhammad always was very sympathetic towards the widows. So there is a convergence of Deobandi school, Deobandi activities, and the Bengali Muslim intelligentsia. There is a convergence that they are sharing the same idea that widows should be taken care of and widows should be venerated, widows should be allowed to remarry. This is one important aspect. And actually, being influenced by the Deobandi school, Bengali Muslim writers were also writing that majority of the Prophet's wives had been widows. Aisha was not a widow, but other wives were widows, including Khadija. In this way, widow remarriage was being popularized by the Muslim intelligentsia during that period. That is very much important. দুঃখ ভারাতুর বঙ্গ বিধবা হিসেবে খাদিজাকে কল্পনা করা হয়েছে in Fazlul Karim's book. I have mentioned Hazrat Khadija. In that book, Khadija was projected as Dukkho Bharatur Bongo Vidova. So this aspect, so contemporary society played a significant role in reviving the image of Khadija, who himself was a widow but was an empowered widow within Islam during the prophetic era. I have mentioned earlier that she was the first person apart from the Prophet who embraced Islam, the new religion. The Fazlul Karim says that the majority of the wives were widows, wives of the prophets had been widows. Ashraf Ali Thanawi says that who is a Deobandi scholar, Ashraf Ali Thanawi, who wrote Behesti Zewar in Urdu in 1900 or something like that. Behesti Zewar, that is heavenly ornaments. It's a gender-related book, as you can understand. There he elaborated his views that the grooms are very greedy. Grooms greed for property discouraged widow remarriage, because grooms will not get much property if they married a widow. So they were reluctant to marry a widow. This was the version of Ashraf Ali Thanawi of Deoband. Fazlul Karim said that there is an advantage, very interesting argument. There's an advantage of marrying a widow, because a widow who was married earlier was very experienced, had domestic skill. So if a Muslim man married a widow, there is some advantage as well. He might not get property, but he will be married to a very experienced lady who can, from the very beginning, take care of household activities, unlike another lady who was not married before. So this is one version by Fazlul Karim. Akram Khan very importantly pointed out by citing a Sahih Hadith, that is authentic Hadith, that it was customary in the prophetic era, that is, it's a sunnah, that taking the permission of an adult lady is important in Muslim society before arranging for her marriage. This was mentioned by Akram Khan. Now, Akram Khan was challenged regarding various aspects. I probably do not have the time to do that. I have to wind up, but during the discussion, I can discuss on that. Akram Khan has been challenged by other Bengali Muslim intelligentsia for various other reasons. Now, Sir Soyed Ahmed Khan, Amir Ali, and others, those who were actually in favor of monogamy, they pointed out, they actually focused more on the very successful conjugal life involving the Prophet Muhammad and Khadija. They directly did not say that they preferred monogamy, but they said under normal circumstances, monogamy is preferable, because during the 25 years of very successful, meaningful conjugal life involving the Prophet and Khadija, the Prophet did not marry for the second time during that first 25 years of his married life. And that was a very successful life with empowered Khadija present in the family of the Prophet. So actually, it is very difficult to maintain equality when you have many wives. So under normal circumstances, the spirit of the Quran says that monogamy is preferable, because in reality, it is very difficult to maintain equity when the behavioral concern is there involving all the wives. So it is better to have one wife under such circumstances. This spirit was recognized in various Islamic states, like in Northern Africa and Middle East. This is very much important. This debate became very important in the early 20th century. They cited the example of, so indirectly by citing the example of Khadija, in the urban debate, people who were in favor of monogamy, they cited the example of Khadija. So the image of Khadija became important for this reason. And regarding divorce was discouraged by the likes of Maulvi Akram Khan, Maulana Akram Khan, who was an alim. That divorce or talaq, misuse of divorce, is equivalent to bidat. Bidat means innovation. That is against the sunnah. So misuse of talaq is bidat, or against the sunnah. That is not in conformity with the way of the Prophet or Tariqa-e Muhammadiyah. That is not in conformity with the prophetic way. So Talaq was discouraged. It should be the ultimate resource. It should not be misused. It should not be frequently used. And they cited the example from Prophet's life that Prophet just reared one slave, a manumitted slave in Prophet's family was Zaid. So by citing the case of Zaid and his wife Zainab, it was cited that this example was cited that the Prophet was opposed to the misuse of talaq. This is very important. And in novel Abdullah by Qazi Imdadul Haq, novel is very important. It was appearing in the 1920s. This novel Abdullah, simple marriage is prescribed. This is very significant. And the case of Fatima and Ali had been cited that look, Fatima and Ali were involved in a simple marriage, because if you do not engage yourself in a simple marriage, you will be sliding into the eternal death trap of a Mahajan, and the Mahajan happened to be a Hindu Mahajan. So this is the case. If in case of simple marriage, you don't have to be indebted to the Mahajan. You can live a very happy and meaningful life. So simple marriage was prescribed in the novel Abdullah by Qazi Imdadul Haq. Khadija was the ideal life partner, was a just trader. Just trader was Muhammad. I was the caravan leader, ideal caravan leader, Mir Karwa. It was a time, as we have mentioned, when printing technology was emerging. Puthi literature was being replaced by printed literature, Sirat literature, which was often written in chaste Bengali, Sadhu Bangla. It confirmed the emergence of Bengali Muslim educated middle class, and Pir Abu Bakr of Furfura also played a significant role here. So I wind up by saying that Khadija and Aisha were popular in urban Bengal. But Fatima, who is the symbol of mystical knowledge, was popular in rural Bengal. And I wind up by citing just one example since I've mentioned Fatima. Fatima is compared as an empowered woman in the Bengal countryside. Namaddam Mas Kalandar Ali the Pahla number. Ali is the husband of Fatima. Fatima is very important. Empowered Fatima, Ma Barkat, popular as Ma Barkat in the Bengal countryside. Ma Barkat. Fatima never visited India, but she is popular as Ma Barkat, the auspicious mother. I am just winding up by quoting one folk song that is a rain song. I have mentioned about rain song in Persian a while ago while referring to Persian texts. Now I wind up by citing one rain song in the Bengali language, in the colloquial language, where Fatima, who is popular in the countryside, is venerated, unlike Aisha and Khadija, who were popular in the rural pockets. So in the Bengal countryside, this rain song is like that. This is an example of empowered Fatima. Aye re Megh Rani, Thang Dhui Dhui Phela Pani, Bibi Fatima Khoje Pani, Allah Tui Dere Pani. So in this way, Fatima became empowered in the Bengal countryside. So there are different aspects of gender empowerment in folk literature, but I have another speaker, very erudite, Dr. Aparna Bandyopadhyay. I have to stop here. I have exceeded my time limit. So I'm sorry for that, but thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Yes, of course, maybe we have overshot a bit, but your presentation was so lively. It was so brilliant, and we can talk about it the entire day. And there have been, as expected, a large number of questions. So, sir, it's a small request to you that if you can keep the answers very brief, then we might be able to cover all the questions. The first question is posed by Tonmoy De, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Krishnanagar Government College. His question is, can Razia be named as Sultana Razia, as we know that she never married a sultan?
Razia?
Can Razia be named as Sultana Razia, as we know that she never married a sultan?
Okay. Very good question. Any other questions? Shall I take questions together?
Yes, sir, no, sir, there's a wide range of questions. So I think you should just give a brief answer and then I'll move on to the next question.
Sure. That will be nice. Now, I won't say that. It's a very good question. Thank you for the question. Actually, Rabia was an empowered mystical lady. Look at the difference. Rabia was so engrossed in her spiritual quest that she thought that if she got the offer of marriage, one very illustrious saint offered to marry her, but she refused, Rabia, because she was so engrossed in the spiritual quest that she thought that family activities will be jeopardizing her spiritual quest. So that is one consideration that is different from the consideration of Sultana Razia. Razia wanted to remain unmarried actually for another reason. She did not want the empire to be subdivided among different people. So she remained unmarried and she wanted to monopolize power. If she got married, then she would be dominated by her husband and there could be a claim to raise her husband as the monarch. So under political circumstances, Razia remained unmarried. Under spiritual circumstances, Rabia remained unmarried. These are different cases, but both are empowered ladies. Both are empowered ladies. That is very important. Thank you for the query.
Thank you, sir. The next question is supposed to be Momita Dasgupta, who's a faculty member of our college. Her question is, the Sufi influence in Indian society has been syncretic in nature. Now, in this context, what was the role played by Fatima Bibi?
Fatima Bibi now, which Fatima Bibi? There are many Fatimas. Could you make it clear? Okay. Remember, Fatima flourished during the prophetic time. She did not come to India. She is venerated as Ma Barkat, or the auspicious mother. I mean, the Fatima is the beloved daughter of the Prophet. But this is a very popular name. There are several female saints, more than one female saints, who were known as Bibi Fatima or Fatima Sam, popular in northern India. And I have mentioned that Jahanara also had a nickname, Fatima. So which Fatima you are speaking about? The Fatima Sufi saint of northern India, they played a very significant role. But remember, regarding their constraints, because they were very venerated as female, very much venerated as female saints. But their constraint was that they were disadvantaged because they were women, that I have to acknowledge. They could not leave behind any silsila or Sufi order like their male counterparts. They could not leave behind any Sufi text like Malfuzat or Maktubat or Tazkira like their male counterparts. That is, they did not leave behind their instructions very systematically produced in the manuscript form. This was reserved for the male Sufis. But still, these female Sufis were fighting for justice, fighting for recognition. So this was their solo effort. They are spiritual loners. But as spiritual loners, they are fighting for equality, they are fighting for justice, they are fighting for empowerment, emancipation, and egalitarian principles should be ushered in by the society. They were expecting that. But they still remained isolated. But remember, they did not belong to any particular Sufi order. They were spiritual loners. Unlike the male Sufis, they did not leave behind any particular Sufi order. Moinuddin Chishti established the Chishti order. No? So the female Sufis did not create any order. They did not leave behind any major book, Tazkira, Malfuzat, or Maktubat. No, but male Sufis left behind any systematic instructions for their followers. So these were the limitations, but still they were fighting for justice. But this was the entry point. They set the ball rolling. Herein lies their importance. When Fatima was imagined in the Bengal countryside as the empowered Fatima, she was acting in the popular imagination, was acting as a counterpart of Saraswati and Kali. Saraswati and Kali had been the empowered female deities, but deification is not allowed in Islam. It's a monotheistic religion. So Fatima was the counterpart in a way, that in a mystical way she was imagined as an empowered lady, as I mentioned when I recited that folk song. So in this way, Fatima became important, not in the real sense always. Thank you for your question, Momita.
Thank you, sir. The next question, two questions can be taken together, sir, to shorten things easier. One question is asked by Pratiti Bhattacharya, and other is by Aditi Bose. Now, question of Protiti Bhattacharya is, can you talk about the greater independence, but the reasons for the greater independence accorded to women among the Turkish tribes? And Aditi Bose's question is, what was the position of women in sacred spaces like Dargah, which were most often considered as male-dominated spheres? So, I mean, I thought two oppositional points of view. So, if you can talk about it together.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important questions, Protiti and Aditi. Both had been our very bright MPhil students in Calcutta University. Actually, I've indicated that certain Turkish tribes had been matriarchal. Even when the women had been very young, they were put on horseback so that they develop the skill to ride a horse. So masculinity was associated in their grooming. In their grooming process, masculinity had been associated. So in this way, some of the Turkish tribes, you have to understand that Turkish situation was different from Arab situation. It was different from entirely desert situation. So you understand the camp life, the domination of males in a desert situation. Masculinity is very important in a desert situation, and the Turkish were very ambulatory people. They were not regional. They had to move from one place to another because of their ambulatory nature. Even if you remember the Mughals they were Turks. Mughals were Turks. They would be moving with their camps. That is almost the capital city is moving along the Mughals. This is the case. If you see the film Jodha Akbar, you will understand that the camp it's a civilization of moving camp. So experience is different. Under such circumstances, women had to be empowered. If you see Mughal paintings, you will find that women were featuring in Mughal paintings. So in this way, the Turkish people came in India in large numbers, but not the Arab-speaking people. Arabs came, but not in large numbers. But Turkish people came, Iranians came, Central Asians came. So this Turkish habit of preserving a matriarchal society became prominent. So, and most of the Sufis were had Turkish origin, like Nizamuddin Hawliya himself. So in this way, Turkish practices became prominent among the Sufis, and that coincided with theological practices of the Sufis, which was also favorably disposed towards the women. Regarding Aditi's question, yes, I would say that it's not a monolithic situation. Position of women or respectability of women can vary from Dargah to Dargah. You can find in some Dargahs where women are distanced from the Mazar. Women are asked to maintain a distance from the Mazar. There would be Dargahs also where women came to enjoy a greater amount of mobility, greater amount of freedom. So there's an element of heterogeneity so far as treatment unleashed towards the women followers in the Dargah. It depends on the silsila, I would say. Some of the silsilas are very comparatively conservative. Some of the silsilas are very liberal or comparatively liberal. And the second factor responsible for this varied gesture towards women is that local culture. Sometimes local culture allows women to be more ambulatory, more mobile. For example, look at Bengal. In Bengal, women can move more freely because of certain agricultural or agrarian habits, eco-geographical habits. So these sort of factors played a crucial role. So it's a monolith, not a monolithic structure. Position of women varied from Dargah to Dargah. Sometimes they enjoyed a greater amount of freedom. Sometimes they were not allowed that freedom because of the local existing custom, local tradition. Thank you for your question, Aditi. Any other question?
Thank you, sir. There are some more questions, but the